Hey guys, it's Mrs. Groom, and we're going to do our first chapter of sticky notes. So make sure you have your textbook open to chapter 1 on page 1 and your post-it notes and a pen. So first we're going to look at the case study that's a part of this chapter, and this case study is called the Mysterious Neuse River Fish Killer. There was a massive fish kill. What they researchers who went to go study it became sick. What they found was that there was a microscopic organism named Pfiesteria that killed the fish. Now, Pfiesteria has lots of different kind of life cycle, not life cycles, but stages in its life, and it only becomes carnivorous when there is a large influx of nutrients like nitrogen, phosphate, things like that. So they found that there was a large amount of nutrients and then looked upriver to see that there were large hog farms upriver, and this, of course, affected recreation and fishing industries because people couldn't even swim and there was no fish because they were all dead. What we've learned, this teaches us about environmental science because it shows the human impact, and so there's so many things that have human impact that we don't even know about, and don't even anticipate. Also, environmental science can be controversial, so there were people who didn't believe that this story and the events and the way that it was said, didn't necessarily believe that the organisms became carnivorous, and also showed that findings are not always clear cut. So you're not always going to get a straight up answer. All right, let's get into the actual chapter itself. Environmental science is the study of ecosystems. And an ecosystem includes all the biotic and abiotic factors. Biotic meaning all the living factors, and abiotic meaning all of the non-living factors. On page 3, what's important for you to know is the difference between environmental science, environmentalist, and environmental studies. Environmental studies is a much broader study of environmental science, but it includes all sorts of other topics: law, economics, literature, politics, and all the different types of sciences. So environmental studies is the overall kind of big study of everything having to do with the environment. Environmental science is the science aspect of it. So if you are an environmental scientist, you study the science behind the environment. You do experiments and find answers to questions using science. An environmentalist, however, is someone who's more of an activist, someone who participates in environmentalism but isn't necessarily doing science, the science behind it. Okay, and so a lot of political, social activists and people are environmentalists. Okay, so then go ahead and over here, humans alter natural systems. Just go ahead and read that part and be familiar with some of the ways that humans alter natural systems. Then we're on to page 5. And this chapter is going to teach us about the 5 environmental indicators. The 5 environmental indicators: biodiversity, food production, average global temps and CO2, human population, and resource depletion. Now, the cool thing about these 5 environmental indicators is that we will be learning these all year. I mean, this is what our course is about. So this book goes into much more detail about these. In this part of the chapter, it's just going to be very brief, just kind of give you a taste. So you need to understand what an environmental indicator is, what its purpose is, and then what it's kind of going towards, and that would be sustainability. The fact that you're not using too much of the resource so that it becomes depleted. So the idea is to use these indicators to help us achieve sustainability. So then it's going to go into detail on each environmental indicator, so I just want you to read those and kind of become familiar with those. We have biodiversity or biological diversity. You do need to know the 3 scales of biodiversity: genetic, species, and ecosystem. Genetic being the smallest scale, looking at the differences and variation of genes. species looking at differences and variation of species, and ecosystem looking at the different types of ecosystems. All of these, the more variables, the more varied you have it, the more biodiverse an area is. Okay, so that is biological diversity. That continues on to page 7. Then it looks at, on page 8, food production. Moving on to page 9, average global surface temps and carbon dioxide concentrations. Again, we'll cover all this more, but just to get a basic idea, I do want to point out a vocab term, anthropogenic. Whenever you see that term, that means human activities, a human caused. So that's a very important. A lot of times we're looking at anthropogenic versus natural activities. Okay, turning to page 10, human population, resource depletion. Okay, and then that kind of finishes up the environmental indicators. So make sure that you have read those. You do not need to worry about the math right now. So again, talked about the fact that these environmental indicators, the goal is to help humans develop sustainable practices. So you need to know the story of Easter Island. And it talks about the story here, Easter Island, unfortunate island off the coast of South America that depleted all of its resources because they didn't give time for the stuff to grow back. And yeah, so then there's no longer anything living there, no people and no trees. So also on this page 12, what does it mean to live sustainably? Here you have kind of the requirements for sustainable living, and this is going to guide us as we go through. So just read defining human needs, and then moving on to the ecological footprint. So let's talk about what the ecological footprint is. We'll switch over to page 14. You need to know what the ecological footprint is, and it's measured in land area and how much land area is needed to supply all the goods and services that you would individually need, either as an individual, as a country, things like that. Okay, so you need to understand what an ecological footprint is looking at. The rest of the chapter is focusing on the scientific method, the process of science. So you do need to know the scientific method. We will be spending a lot of time covering science practices throughout our course, but the scientific method here looks at the basics of the science process, about making observations, asking questions, forming hypotheses, setting up your variables. So on to page 16. Then it talks about how to collect data. You don't need to worry about accuracy versus precision versus uncertainty. You just need to know the basics of kind of what's happening here. Finally, interpreting results and then disseminating your findings. Okay, so just a good background knowledge of what's happening there. We'll talk a lot about science practices more later. This is a case study. You can read it. It just gives you a good comparison of what they're looking at with the process. Okay, now on to page 18. It's looking at controlled versus natural experiments, and so this is something that is kind of a big deal in environmental science, because natural experiments are those that you go out and you study nature and kind of watch as it progresses, versus controlled experiments, which happen in a laboratory, or you have controlled all of the variables. A lot of times it's difficult for environmental scientists to do controlled experiments, so there's a lot of natural experiments. And then of course there are some issues with that and the time that it takes. So the challenges that environmental science presents, there are three major challenges. Lack of baseline data. So there's no really good control group or comparison for a lot of the things that environmental scientists do. Like, there is no Earth that has not been touched. There's no Earth that we can compare everything else too. So can be difficult. Subjectivity is another issue. Interactions. Subjectivity is talked about on page 20, and that's the idea that a lot of times people are putting their own kind of opinion on things, and so sometimes people may, that can change how it's interpreted. And then interactions. There are so many complex interactions within systems that it's difficult to study these and control them. We've got the principle of equity versus environmental justice, and we'll look at how these affect throughout this entire unit, so make sure you understand what those mean. All right, and that is it.